Good morning. I'm Teresa Kanan with Sitchin Tree Quilts, and this is our 9th segment of our For Marty and Me Club. This week we'll be exploring Marty's Dresden Delights. It uses Marty's pattern, Dresden Delights, which is an exclusive pattern from our For Marty and Me Club, and it also uses the mini Dresden plate. The mini Dresden plate makes a Dresden plate unit at the center of each star block that either can be a 3-inch wide Dresden plate or 5.5-inch wide. For the purpose of our project here, we'll be using the 5.5-inch wide. We'll also be using the Flying Geese tool and template set A. It's not necessary to have the Flying Geese tool, as I'll show you in the video how you can use template set A to construct your flying geese. To square up our blocks, we use Marty's 6.5-inch square up tool, which I really like because of the 1/8-inch increments on the tool. One of the advantages of being in the club or seeing the videos is getting some of the information in advance prior to your own cutting regarding the things I learned as I was constructing our store sample. I'll go over some of those pieces of information before we get started on cutting. Let's take a look at Marty's pattern. On the inside page of Marty's Dresden Delights pattern, you'll see color images of a table runner, and on the back page an additional design. And Marty's pattern is chock full of additional project patterns. On the inside cover, page 3 in black and white, is the history of the Dresden plate and why Marty chose that to be included in her template set. Page 4 begins with the template set and how we use it to make the pointed petals. Page 5 is some strip cutting tips. Page 6 is how you use the pointed petal template on the strips, and this template actually shows as Marty's large Dresden plate template set. Page 7 is the small Dresden plate template set and how to cut that, and that's what we'll be using for our Dresden Delights quilt. Page 8 goes over fussy cutting, which you may choose to do for your Dresden petals. On page 9 there's a couple of things to take note of. When sewing your pointed petals together in chain piecing, you're going to sew them towards the fold, and that's not in the instructions. Take note of it. It is shown in the image that way. Also, Marty tells us under instruction number 5 to use a short back stitch when we're putting the units together in sets of 2. That's pretty important when you're making your Dresden plate. Page 10 indicates to us how we can make our Dresden plate with the rounded corners, and that template is also included in your template set. Page 11 is more information on making the rounded Dresden plate. On page 12, it starts with how we complete the blocks. Make a star or make a note of the wiggle room for your background squares. That's right here. That's very important. You do need that extra inch of allowance. And on page 13, it points out that on page 37 and 38, 39 is where you go to get the center circle pattern for the inside of your Dresden plates. Page 14 is how you square up your blocks, and 15. And then on page 16 we begin the pattern of Dresden Delights. The notes that I made on page 17 regarding the fabric requirements, her requirements of the 15 to 24 fat quarters is appropriate. The numbers are, but you won't even come close to using a fat quarter. I had cut fat 8s for our store sample, and I still had well over half of those fat 8s left. So you really do just need a scrap of everything. There are 9 blocks total. Each block has 16 petals, so if you want to know the number of petals, there are 144 petals for the Dresden Delights quilt. On page 17, Marty says to cut 7 strips of background fabric that are 3.5-inch wide under step number 3. You'll be using your template set A square 1 in order to make those cuts. You will not just be using your rotary ruler. You'll cut the way Marty has taught us to cut, and that is shown on the video. Page 18 and 19 are the construction instructions for the blocks and the quilt. And page 20 is the setting instructions to finish the quilt. Then on page 21, Marty has an alternate quilt, which is an alternate way of setting the Dresden fans, and yet one more way, and that uses a 1/4 Dresden plate. Page 24 and 25, there are binding instructions for binding the quilt. That can come in handy with any quilt that you might have. Page 26 begins a table runner. Page 30 is a batik quilt, and page 31 begins with some pillows that you can make using the Marty's Dresden plate fan. Additional pillows can be found on page 32 and 33. Page 34 and 35 are how to make ruffles on your pillow, and then page 36 begins the templates that are made of paper in case you do not purchase the template set. Let's go ahead and get started on our project. Marty's pattern calls for the use of 15 to 24 fat quarters. That's to ensure variety for your petals on your Dresden plate. There's actually 16 petals on the Dresden plate, so you could get by with 16 fat eighths. That's what we have here, are 16 fat eighths. They're 9 inches wide by 22 inches long. We use the petals line from Quilting Treasures. Kind of looks like an antique fabric, has the look of an old vintage fabric, but it's not a 30s print. If you have any collection of small scale prints or a collection of 30s prints, this would be a great use for it in this particular quilt. And you don't have to stick to that 1/4 yard or fat eighth guideline, because you can make your quilt scrappy. One of the advantages of being in our Marty and Me Club, besides these exciting videos, is learning in advance some of the mistakes that I made so that you don't make the same mistakes when you construct your quilt. When I constructed the quilt that I used for the store sample here, I used 16 different fabrics. The Dresden plate itself requires 16 fabrics, and then the star is on the outside. And if you'll note, on my blocks, I used one of the same 16 fabrics as I had chosen for inside the Dresden plate. And in every single star block, that Dresden plate fan jumps out to me as being the same fabric that I used in the Dresden plate. If I had to do it all over again, I would have chosen at least 17 fabrics so I could have alternated those fabrics and didn't have that duplication within any block. The next thing that I learned as I constructed my blocks, when I put my Dresden plates onto the block itself, I used a 505 spray, which was a good method, but I did not pay attention to its placement within the square. We'll begin by cutting the petals. Whether you're cutting from 1/4 yard cuts, fat quarter cuts, or scraps, you'll have to start with a squared edge. So you'll start out by straightening out the edge. I happen to have 4 pieces of fabric here. You straighten out that edge like we've always done in the past, and then you use Marty's template. In this case, it's template B for the mini Dresden, and you'll line that template up with that straight edge of your fabric. We'll cut a strip just like we've cut with other Marty templates, using the template as our measuring guide. Take those pieces of fabric, turn them on their side, and we're ready to cut our template units. Because I've chosen 16 different fabrics and there's 16 petals, I will need to have 1 petal for each of the 9 blocks, so I'll need 9 of each color. You'll have to do your own math to determine the number of petals that you'll need. You will need a total of 144 petals to make Dresden Delights. There are no engineered corners to cut, so once you've cut your Dresden plate petals Go ahead and stack them into piles so they'll make sense for you when you're doing your piecing. I've stacked mine into 9 different separate piles so that I'll have a different fabric for each petal in each Dresden plate. On page 9 of Marty's pattern, Marty describes how to make the Dresden plate petals. It's really a lot simpler than what it looks like when you actually look at the pattern. You'll begin with the template shape and you'll fold it in half the long side of the petal. And you'll chain piece it through your machine with that widest end first, going towards the fold. You can see here I've chain pieced 16. That's all the petals in my Dresden plate. Once you've chain pieced them, you snip them apart. You'll use your scissors to cut a diagonal edge there, and then you'll turn your Dresden plate out, and it's just that simple. See how easy that was to make that Dresden plate unit. Do that for all 144 pieces.